Little House on the Prairie series by Laura Ingalls Wilder. Book 2, Little House on the Prairie. Chapter 22, Prairie Fire. Spring had come. The warm winds smelled exciting, and all outdoors was large and bright and sweet. Big white shining clouds floated high up in clear space. Their shadows floated over the prairie. The shadows were thin and brown, and all the rest of the prairie was the pale, soft colors of dead grasses. Pa was breaking the prairie sod, with Pet and Patty hitched to the breaking plow. The sod was a tough, thick mass of grass roots. Pet and Patty slowly pulled with all their might, and the sharp plow slowly turned over a long, unbroken strip of that sod. The dead grass was so tall and thick that it held up the sod. Where Pa had plowed, he didn't have a plowed field. The long strips of grass roots lay on top of grass, and grass stuck out between them. But Pa and Pet and Patty kept on working. He said that sod potatoes and sod corn would grow this year, and next year the roots and the dead grasses would be rotted. In 2 or 3 years he would have nicely plowed fields. Pa liked the land because it was so rich, and there wasn't a tree or a stump or a rock in it. Now a great many Indians came riding along the Indian trail. Indians were everywhere. Their guns echoed in the creek bottoms where they were hunting. No one knew how many Indians were hidden in the prairie, which seemed so level but wasn't. Often Laura saw an Indian where no one had been an instant before. Indians often came to the house. Some were friendly, some were surly and cross. All of them wanted food and tobacco, and Ma gave them what they wanted. She was afraid not to. When an Indian pointed at something and grunted, Ma gave him that thing. But most of the food was kept hidden and locked up. Jack was cross all the time, even with Laura. He was never let off the chain, and all the time he lay and hated the Indians. Laura and Mary were quite used to seeing them now. Indians didn't surprise them at all, but they always felt safer near Pa or Jack. One day they were helping Ma get dinner. Baby Carrie was playing on the floor in the sunshine, and suddenly the sunshine was gone. "I do believe it's going to storm," Ma said, looking out of the window. Laura looked too, and great black clouds were billowing up in the south across the sun. Pet and Patty were coming running from the field, Pa holding to the heavy plow and bounding in long leaps behind them.
"Prairie fire!"
he shouted.
"Grab the tub full of water. Put sacks in it. Hurry!"
Ma ran to the well. Laura ran to tug the tub to it. Pa tied Pet to the house. He brought the cow and calf from the picket line and shut them in the stable. He caught Bunny and tied her fast to the north corner of the house. Ma was pulling up buckets of water as fast as she could. Laura ran to get the sacks that Pa had flung out of the stable. Pa was plowing, shouting at Pet and Patty to make them hurry. The sky was black now. The air was as dark as if the sun had set. Pa plowed a long furrow west of the house and south of the house, and back again east of the house. Rabbits came bounding past him as if he wasn't there. Pet and Patty came galloping, the plow and Pa bounding behind them. Pa tied them to the other north corner of the house. The tub was full of water. Laura helped Ma push the sacks under the water to soak them.
"I couldn't plow but one furrow. There isn't time,"
Pa said.
"Hurry, Caroline. That fire's coming faster than a horse can run."
A big rabbit bounded right over the tub while Pa and Ma were lifting it. Ma told Laura to stay at the house. Pa and Ma ran staggering to the furrow with the tub. Laura stayed close to the house. She could see the red fire coming under the billows of smoke. More rabbits went leaping by. They paid no attention to Jack, and he didn't think about them. He stared at the red undersides of the rolling smoke and shivered and whined until he crowded close to Laura. The wind was rising and wildly screaming. Thousands of birds flew before the fire. Thousands of rabbits were running. Pa was going along the furrow, setting fire to the grass on the other side of it. Ma followed with a wet sack, beating at the flames that tried to cross the furrow. The whole prairie was hopping with rabbits. Snakes rippled across the yard. Prairie hens ran silently, their necks outstretched and their wings spread. Birds screamed in the screaming wind. Pa's little fire was all around the house now, and he helped Ma fight it with the wet sacks. The fire blew wildly, snatching at the dry grass inside the furrow. Pa and Ma thrashed at it with the sacks. When it got across the furrow, they stamped it with their feet. They ran back and forth in the smoke, fighting that fire. The prairie fire was roaring now, roaring louder and louder in the screaming wind. Great flames came roaring, flaring, and twisting high. Twists of flame broke loose and came down on the wind to blaze up in the grasses far ahead of the roaring wall of fire. A red light came from the rolling black clouds of smoke overhead. Mary and Laura stood against the house and held hands and trembled. Baby Carrie was in the house. Laura wanted to do something, but inside her head was a roaring and whirling like the fire. Her middle shook and tears poured out of her shining eyes. Her eyes and her nose and her throat stung with smoke. Jack howled. Bunny and Pet and Patty were jerking at the ropes and squealing horribly. The orange, yellow, terrible flames were coming faster than horses can run, and their quivering light danced over everything. Pa's little fire had made a burned black strip. The little fire went backing slowly away against the wind. It went slowly crawling to meet the racing, furious big fire, and suddenly the big fire swallowed the little one. The wind rose to a high, crackling, rushing shriek. Flames climbed into the crackling air. Fire was all around the house. Then it was over. The fire went roaring past and away. Pa and Ma were beating out little fires here and there in the yard. When they were all out, Ma came to the house to wash her hands and face. She was all streaked with smoke and sweat, and she was trembling. She said there was nothing to worry about. "The back fire saved us," she said, "and all's well that ends well." The air smelled scorched, and to the very edge of the sky, the prairie was burned naked and black. Threads of smoke rose from it. Ashes blew on the wind. Everything felt different and miserable, but Pa and Ma were cheerful because the fire was gone and it had not done any harm. Pa said that the fire had not missed them far, but a miss is as good as a mile. He asked Ma,
"If it had come while I was in Independence, what would you have done?"
"We would have gone to the creek with the birds and the rabbits, of course," Ma said. All the wild things on the prairie had known what to do. They ran and flew and hopped and crawled as fast as they could go to the water that would keep them safe from fire. Only the little soft striped grass gophers had gone down deep into their holes, and they were the first to come up and look around at the bare, smoking prairie. Then out of the creek bottoms the birds came flying over it, and a rabbit cautiously hopped and looked. It was a long, long time before the snakes crawled out of the bottoms and the prairie hens came walking. The fire had gone out among the bluffs. It had never reached the creek bottoms or the Indian camps. That night, Mr. Edwards and Mr. Scott came to see Pa. They were worried because they thought that perhaps the Indians had started that fire on purpose to burn out the white settlers. Pa didn't believe it. He said the Indians had always burned the prairie to make green grass grow more quickly and traveling easier. Their ponies couldn't gallop through the thick, tall, dead grass. Now the ground was clear, and he was glad of it because plowing would be easier. While they were talking, they could hear drums beating in the Indian camps and shouts. Laura sat still as a mouse on the doorstep and listened to the talk and to the Indians. The stars hung low and large and quivering over the burned prairie, and the wind blew gently in Laura's hair. Mr. Edwards said there were too many Indians in those camps. He didn't like it. Mr. Scott said he didn't know why so many of those savages were coming together if they didn't mean devilment. "The only good Indian is a dead Indian," Mr. Scott said. Pa said he didn't know about that. He figured that Indians would be as peaceable as anybody else if they were let alone. On the other hand, they had been moved west so many times that naturally they hated white folks. But an Indian ought to have sense enough to know when he was licked. With soldiers at Fort Gibson and Fort Dodge, Pa didn't believe these Indians would make any trouble.
"As to why they are congregating in these camps, Scott, I can tell you that,"
He said.
"They're getting ready for their big spring buffalo hunt."
He said there were half a dozen tribes down in those camps. Usually the tribes were fighting each other, but every spring they made peace and all came together for the big hunt.
"They're sworn to peace among themselves,"
He said.
"and they're thinking about hunting the buffalo. So it's not likely they'll start on the warpath against us. They'll have their talks and their feasts, and then one day they'll all hit the trail after the buffalo herds. The buffalo will be working their way north pretty soon, following the green grass. By George, I'd like to go on a hunt like that myself. It must be a sight to see.
Well, maybe you're right about that, Ingalls, Mr. Scott said slowly. Anyway, I'll be glad to tell Mrs. Scott what you say. She can't get the Minnesota massacres out of her head. Little House on the Prairie series by Laura Ingalls Wilder. Book 2, Little House on the Prairie. Chapter 23, Indian War Cry. Next morning, Pa went whistling to his plowing. He came in at noon, black with soot from the burned prairie, but he was pleased. The tall grass didn't bother him anymore. But there was an uneasiness about the Indians. More and more Indians were in the creek bottoms. Mary and Laura saw the smoke from their fires by day, and at night they heard the savage voices shouting. Pa came early from the field. He did the chores early and shut Pet and Patty, Bunny, and the cow and calf into the stable. They could not stay out in the yard to graze in the cool moonlight. When shadows began to gather on the prairie and the wind was quiet, the noises from the Indian camps grew louder and wilder. Pa brought Jack into the house. The door was shut and the latch string pulled in. No one could go outdoors till morning. Night crept toward the little house, and the darkness was frightening. It yelped with Indian yells, and one night it began to throb with Indian drums. In her sleep, Laura heard all the time that savage yipping and the wild, throbbing drums. She heard Jack's claws clicking in his low growl. Sometimes Pa sat up in bed listening. One evening, he took his bullet mold from the box under the bed. He sat for a long time on the hearth, melting lead and making bullets. He did not stop till he had used the last bit of lead. Laura and Mary lay awake and watched him. He had never made so many bullets at one time before. Mary asked, "What makes you do that, Pa?"
Oh, I haven't anything else to do,
Pa said, and he began to whistle cheerfully. But he had been plowing all day. He was too tired to play the fiddle. He might have gone to bed instead of sitting up so late making bullets. No more Indians came to the house. For days, Mary and Laura had not seen a single Indian. Mary did not like to go out of the house any more. Laura had to play outdoors by herself, and she had a queer feeling about the prairie. It didn't feel safe. It seemed to be hiding something. Sometimes Laura had a feeling that something was watching her, something was creeping up behind her. She turned around quickly, and nothing was there. Mr. Scott and Mr. Edwards, with their guns, came and talked to Pa in the field. They talked quite a while, then they went away together. Laura was disappointed because Mr. Edwards did not come to the house. At dinner, Pa said to Ma that some of the settlers were talking about a stockade. Laura didn't know what a stockade was. Pa had told Mr. Scott and Mr. Edwards that it was a foolish notion. He told Ma,
If we need one, we'd need it before we could get it built. And the last thing we want to do is act like we're afraid.
Mary and Laura looked at each other. They knew it was no use to ask questions. They would only be told again that children must not speak at table until they were spoken to, or that children should be seen and not heard. That afternoon, Laura asked Ma what a stockade was. Ma said it was something to make little girls ask questions. That meant that grown-ups would not tell you what it was. And Mary looked a look at Laura that said, "I told you so." Laura didn't know why Pa said he must not act as if he were afraid. Pa was never afraid. Laura didn't want to act as if she were afraid, but she was. She was afraid of the Indians. Jack never laid back his ears and smiled at Laura anymore. Even while she petted him, his ears were lifted, his neck bristled, and his lips twitched back from his teeth. His eyes were angry. Every night he growled more fiercely, and every night the Indian drums beat faster, faster, and the wild yipping rose higher and higher, faster and wilder. In the middle of the night, Laura sat straight up and screamed. Some terrible sound had made cold sweat come out all over her. Ma came to her quickly and said in her gentle way, "Be quiet, Laura. You mustn't frighten Carrie." Laura clung to Ma, and Ma was wearing her dress. The fire was covered with ashes, and the house was dark, but Ma had not gone to bed. Moonlight came through the window. The shutter was open, and Pa stood in the dark by the window, looking out. He had his gun. Out in the night, the drums were beating, and the Indians were wildly yelling. Then that terrible sound came again. Laura felt as if she were falling. She couldn't hold on to anything. There was nothing solid anywhere. It seemed a long time before she could see or think or speak. She screamed, "What is it? What is it? Oh, Pa, what is it?" She was shaking all over, and she felt sick in her middle. She heard the drums pounding and the wild yipping sounds, and she felt Ma holding her safe. Pa said,
"It's the Indian war cry, Laura."
Ma made a soft sound, and he said to her,
"They might as well know, Caroline."
He explained to Laura that that was the Indian way of talking about war. The Indians were only talking about it and dancing around their fires. Mary and Laura must not be afraid, because Pa was there, and Jack was there, and soldiers were at Fort Gibson and Fort Dodge.
"So don't be afraid, Mary and Laura,"
he said again. Laura gasped and said, "No, Pa." But she was horribly afraid. Mary couldn't say anything. She lay shivering under the covers. Then Carrie began to cry, so Ma carried her to the rocking chair and gently rocked her. Laura crept out of bed and huddled against Ma's knee, and Mary, left all alone, crept after her and huddled close too. Pa stayed by the window, watching. The drums seemed to beat in Laura's head. They seemed to beat deep inside her. The wild, fast yipping yells were worse than wolves. Something worse was coming. Laura knew it. Then it came, the Indian war cry. A nightmare is not so terrible as that night was. A nightmare is only a dream, and when it is worst, you wake up. But this was real, and Laura could not wake up. She could not get away from it. When the war cry was over, Laura knew it had not got her yet. She was still in the dark house, and she was pressed close against Ma. Ma was trembling all over. Jack's howling ended in a sobbing growl. Carrie began to scream again, and Pa wiped his forehead and said,
"Phew! I never heard anything like it."
Pa said. He asked,
"How do you suppose they learned to do it?"
but nobody answered that.
"They don't need guns. That yell's enough to scare anybody to death,"
he said.
"My mouth's so dry I couldn't whistle a tune to save my life. Bring me some water, Laura."
That made Laura feel better. She carried a dipper full of water to Pa at the window. He took it and smiled at her, and that made her feel very much better. He drank a little and smiled again and said,
"There, now I can whistle."
He whistled a few notes to show her that he could. Then he listened, and Laura too heard far away the soft pitter-pat, pat-pat, pitter-pat-pat of a pony's galloping. It came nearer. From one side of the house came the drum throbbing and the fast, shrill, yapping yells, and from the other side came the lonely sound of the riders galloping. Nearer and nearer it came. Now the hooves clattered loudly, and suddenly they were going by. The galloping went by and grew fainter down the creek road. In the moonlight, Laura saw the behind of a little black Indian pony, and an Indian on its back. She saw a huddle of blanket and a naked head and a flutter of feathers above it, and moonlight on a gun barrel, and then it was all gone. Nothing was there but empty prairie. Pa said he was derned if he knew what to make of it. He said that was the Osage who had tried to talk French to him. He asked,
"What's he doing out at this hour riding hell-bent for leather?"
Nobody answered because nobody knew. The drums throbbed and the Indians went on yelling. The terrible war cry came again and again. Little by little, after a long time, the yells grew fainter and fewer. At last, Carrie cried herself to sleep. Ma sent Mary and Laura back to bed. Next day, they could not go out of the house. Pa stayed close by. There was not one sound from the Indian camps. The whole vast prairie was still. Only the wind blew over the blackened earth where there was no grass to rustle. The wind blew past the house with a rushing sound like running water. That night, the noise in the Indian camps was worse than the night before. Again, the war cries were more terrible than the most dreadful nightmare. Laura and Mary huddled close against Ma. Poor little baby Carrie cried. Pa watched at the window with his gun. And all night long, Jack paced and growled and screamed when the war cries came. The next night, and the next night, and the next night were worse and worse. Mary and Laura were so tired that they fell asleep while the drums pounded and the Indians yelled. But a war cry always jerked them wide awake in terror. And the silent days were even worse than the nights. Pa watched and listened all the time. The plow was in the field where he had left it. Pet and Patty and the colt and the cow and calf stayed in the barn. Mary and Laura could not go out of the house. and Pa never stopped looking at the prairie all around and turning his head quickly toward the smallest noise. He ate hardly any dinner. He kept getting up and going outdoors to look all around the prairie. One day his head nodded down to the table, and he slept there. Ma and Mary and Laura were still to let him sleep. He was so tired that in a minute he woke up with a jump and said sharply to Ma,
"Don't let me do that again."
"Jack was on guard," Ma said gently. That night was worst of all. The drums were faster and the yells were louder and fiercer. All up and down the creek war cries answered war cries, and the bluffs echoed. There was no rest. Laura ached all over, and there was a terrible ache in her very middle. At the window, Pa said,
"Caroline, they're quarreling among themselves. Maybe they'll fight each other."
"Oh, Charles, if they only will," Ma said. All night there was not a minute's rest. Just before dawn, a last war cry ended, and Laura slept against Ma's knee. She woke up in bed. Mary was sleeping beside her. The door was open, and by the sunshine on the floor, Laura knew it was almost noon. Ma was cooking dinner. Pa sat on the doorstep. He said to Ma,
"There's another big party going off to the south."
Laura went to the door in her nightgown, and she saw a long line of Indians far away. The line came up out of the black prairie, and it went farther away southward. The Indians on their ponies were so small in the distance that they looked not much bigger than ants. Pa said that 2 big parties of Indians had gone west that morning. Now this one was going south. It meant that the Indians had quarreled among themselves. They were going away from their camps in the creek bottoms. They would not go all together to their big buffalo hunt. That night the darkness came quietly. There was no sound except the rushing of the wind.
"Tonight we'll sleep,"
Pa said, and they did. All night long they did not even dream. And in the morning Jack was still sleeping limp and flat on the same spot where he had been sleeping when Laura went to bed. The next night was still too, and again they all slept soundly. That morning Pa said he felt as fresh as a daisy, and he was going to do a little scouting along the creek. He chained Jack to the ring in the house wall, and he took his gun and went out of sight down the creek road. Laura and Mary and Ma could not do anything but wait until he came back. They stayed in the house and wished he would come. The sunshine had never moved so slowly on the floor as it did that day. But he did come back. Late in the afternoon he came, and everything was all right. He had gone far up and down the creek and had seen many deserted Indian camps. All the Indians had gone away, except a tribe called the Osages. In the woods, Pa had met an Osage who could talk to him. This Indian told him that all the tribes except the Osages had made up their minds to kill the white people who had come into the Indian country, and they were getting ready to do it when the lone Indian came riding into their big powwow. That Indian had come riding so far and fast because he did not want them to kill the white people. He was an Osage, and they called him a name that meant he was a great soldier. Soldat un Chine, Pa said his name was.
"He kept arguing with them day and night,"
Pa said,
"till all the other Osages agreed with him. Then he stood up and told the other tribes that if they started to massacre us, the Osages would fight them."
That was what had made so much noise that last terrible night. The other tribes were howling at the Osages, and the Osages were howling back at them. The other tribes did not dare fight Soldat d'un Chine and all his Osages, so next day they went away.
"That's one good Indian,"
Pa said. No matter what Mr. Scott said, Pa did not believe that the only good Indian was a dead Indian.